Welcome to Kelly's Cult Classics, and this is my booktube channel. So in my last two videos I talked about the books I've read so far during quarantine and the books I was gonna read, and at the time I was in the middle of a book, and so today we're actually going to be reviewing that book, and that is In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. So today I thought I would review it and give you my opinion of it. And let me say right off the bat that I have a very torn opinion, okay? Truman Capote was a journalist and in New York, and he had been given an assignment to go learn more about these murders that had taken place in 1959 in Kansas. And so this book came from a series of articles he wrote for that assignment, and then he developed it more into a book. Also, as I mentioned, when he went to the town to do research about the murders and the pursuit of the killers and then the subsequent trial, he had his childhood friend Harper Lee with him, and she helped him research. And the research process is actually going to become an important reason why I feel torn about the book. But anyway, just a quick synopsis. It's 1959 in Kansas, like rural Kansas, and there's a family called the Clutter family. There's 6 members in the family, the father, the mother, and 4 children. However, the 2 oldest daughters do not live at home anymore. One is married and one is engaged to be married, and they've moved out. So at the time, and the ones who were murdered is the mother, the father, and then their 2 teenage children, the daughter Nancy, who I think was 16, and then the son Kenyon, I think is how you would pronounce it, who's 15. And this takes place in Holcomb, Kansas. They're just a regular family. There's nothing particularly special about them. They are wealthier than most people in the town, and they have a nice farm that's pretty large, but other than that there's nothing really notable about them. So 2 random men named Perry Smith and Eugene Hitchcock come to their farm in the middle of the night and murder them, and they go on the run after, and no one in the town knows who did it originally, because there's no one really with a good motivation to kill the family, and the 2 killers had come from a completely different part of the state and had drove there to kill them, so no one had any leads of who killed the family. And then also the town was just shocked, like this kind of murder just didn't really happen in their town. There really hadn't been a mass slaying of this type where 4 members of an entire family was just killed for no apparent reason in cold blood. And so the work is really an exploration of human nature. Like, why did these 2 guys kill this family? Why did the town react with such fear? And they also looked at their neighbors very suspiciously, because it took 6 weeks for them to eventually find the killer. What happened was there was just this really random connection to a former guy who had been like a farmhand for a short period of time on the farm, like 10 years before, shared a jail cell with Eugene Hitchcock, and mentioned they were talking about former jobs that they had in jail, and the farmhand mentioned that he had worked for this nice family who was pretty wealthy, and Eugene Hitchcock was like, do they have a safe? And the guy was like, yeah. And then he's like, I'm gonna go tie them up and rob them and then kill them all. And the guy at the time didn't think he was serious, because I guess in jail it was a thing for the people in the jail to talk about all the crimes they would commit when they got out, and how they would be masterminds and get away with it. So he didn't really think anything of it until he's lying in his jail cell. I think at this point it's like a year later, I'm not sure, but a while later, and hears that his former employer has been murdered. They were tied up and murdered, and there's no apparent connection whatsoever, and he's just like, oh, I know who did this. And he eventually tells the warden and contacts the authorities, and then the authorities know now who they're looking for, and it takes a few more weeks, but they eventually do catch them, and they get put on trial, and they both confess, and the confessions are just wow. And during the confession part and the part where they're like interrogating the suspects, it kind of delves into like, you know, early 60s criminal psychology, which is interesting to see how much it's developed since then, and really was giving me like early 60s Criminal Mind vibes. You know, I used to love watching Criminal Minds when I was younger, so really got that vibe from that part. So then it goes through their trial and then their subsequent execution, which happened in 1965. Now, the reason I'm torn about this book is because when I was reading it, I at first was really enjoying it. Like, at first it was a little slow going because Capote really meanders his way to the murder and then the suspects fleeing and the whole investigation. It's really a slow opening, but he does that on purpose because he wants to really set up these characters and make you feel invested in these characters, and as if you're really with them, like both the family and the murderers, okay, and the town in general. So at first I was a little like, let's get on with the story. However, once it did get into it, I was really taken by his writing style. He's a very good writer. Some of, like, there was just paragraphs and paragraphs where it's like, man, this is beautiful writing. Like, he describes the murders in such detail that it's like you feel as if you're in the house watching these murders, and that makes it even more sad and just terribly depressing because it's a whole family being murdered in the house. It's not a happy subject, right? I really liked it for that reason, and I'm like, wow, this is so cool. And it was also cool to be reading a book that kind of sparked the true crime craze in America that we see through today. Like, today, everyone loves true crime. Like, one of my favorite things to do is watch true crime documentaries on Netflix. To say we're a society who loves reading and watching about true crime would be an understatement. I think we're a society obsessed with true crime, and this is kind of the book that started it. Like, there was another really famous true crime writer before Capote, however, like, his book didn't spark the sensation that In Cold Blood did. So it really started that movement, and it inspired later books that also kept the true crime movement going, like Zodiac Killer. So it truly is an important piece of American literature because it really shapes the literature and documentary and TV taste of the American public today, and even in myself. So this book is why I like Netflix documentaries about true crime and people in jail. Like, indirectly, but it's true, right? This book has everything in it for me to really like it. However, okay, I was reading it, and so the two killers, Eugene and Perry, I just was getting the sense, like, so Capote really goes into Perry's background. He also goes into Eugene's background, but I feel like not to the same extent, and he really goes into Perry's psychology, and I just got to the point where I feel like Capote was writing it as if he was trying to excuse Perry, you know? And Perry at least killed two of the people. I personally, like, from what it sounds like, I think Perry probably killed the two men and Hitchcock killed the two women. Like, that seems legitimate to me, and it makes sense based on, like, both of their stories of what happened. So there's a quote that's really famous from the book, and it's said by Perry about Herb Clutter, the father, and he said, "I thought he was a very nice gentleman, soft-spoken. I thought so right up until the moment I cut his throat." So that's, like, not a normal statement. I think most of us would not do something like that, say something like that, being like, oh yeah, I thought he was a really nice person and then I killed him. So Perry has issues, right? He participated willingly, he admitted to killing people, okay, but it just seemed to me as if Capote was really trying to get a lot of sympathy for Perry, that I didn't see that same kind of effort for Hitchcock. And I'm not saying either deserves sympathy, and I'm not saying that either didn't have circumstances that might have influenced how they came out. So, for example, Perry seems like a horrible childhood. Like his parents were very transient people. It sounded like kind of abusive and neglectful. They divorced. He obviously came from a troubled background. And yes, that should elicit some sympathy for anyone who grew up in that kind of background. However, there's a lot of people who grow up in very troubled backgrounds who don't go on to murder people. Like, just because you have a troubled background, that doesn't excuse your actions, especially if you're hurting other people. It might explain it, it doesn't excuse it. And I felt like he was really trying to use this background to like excuse it a little, and that's the vibe I got. However, like Hitchcock, there are some things that explain like why Hitchcock was the way he was, because by all means he had a very normal upbringing. Like nothing in his upbringing would be like, that guy's gonna turn into a killer. The one thing though is when he got to be older, he was in a car accident and hit the front of his head, and then a lot of people say that he changed after that happened. And if you know anything about psychology, the frontal lobe, there's been a lot of cases of people who have damaged their frontal lobe and their personalities have just changed completely. So it might be possible that Hitchcock had frontal lobe damage. Again, that doesn't excuse his actions. There are people who have frontal lobe damage and they just become a different person and they don't go and murder people, right? I wasn't feeling as though Capote was treating Perry and Hitchcock the same, like giving them the same treatment. And so I started to get curious as to why. So I went online and I looked up some background into the writing of the book, and it turns out that Capote actually met both the killers. Like he traveled to this town and he was interviewing all the people, and he traveled there when they were in jail awaiting execution, and he had conversations with both of them, and apparently him and Perry became very close friends. And I don't know if this is true, but I did read something that there were rumors that they had a romantic relationship. So now Truman Capote is an unreliable narrator, and after I learned that, I kind of looked at the whole book skeptically, because it's like, are you really, you know, this is supposed to be a nonfiction book, but are you really giving a nonfiction synopsis of what happened, or is it truly colored by your own feelings towards Perry that you developed during the investigative process? And are those feelings towards Perry affecting how you're telling the story? So it just changed how I saw the book, and it changed how I saw Capote as an author. Like, he's a beautiful writer, don't get me wrong, and he wrote this book splendidly. However, now I'm just kind of like, how much of this is colored by your own opinion? And are you really doing the murder of the family so like the family that was murdered and their surviving relatives justice? So then that got me jigging a little bit more into the book, because I was like, is this accurate? And then that's when I found some other issues that really has me torn, because apparently there are some scenes in this book that didn't actually happen, or that he kind of changed a lot. For example, there's a scene where Nancy's boyfriend runs across the field after he finds out that she's murdered, and is like being chased by his younger brother, and is like crying, and it's very dramatic. At the time I'm like, wow, this is a beautiful scene showing real human emotion. But then I find out that his family later claimed that never happened. So now I'm like, that takes away from the scene. You know, it's one thing if he wasn't trying to pass this off as nonfiction. Apparently when it was published, he said every single word in this is true. Well, that's false, Capote. Not every word in it is true. There was also the family of the Clutters, like the father's brothers and the two daughters and surviving family members have all raised issue with the way their family was portrayed in the book. For example, they disagree with how their mother's mental illness was portrayed. They disagree with the summation of the family's wealth. They say that the wealth of the family was vastly overstated and that the father was actually in debt. And the family itself said that they felt kind of, dogged by Capote, and they didn't like the fact that, and this is a very fair criticism, and it made me reflect on other true crimes that I like to watch, but they criticized the fact that Truman Capote made money off of this famous book that he wrote about their family's actual deaths. Like, the two daughters survived. They weren't at the farm, so they went on to live long lives. So a real family was hurt by these events. A real family was torn apart. Was an entire section of the family was just wiped out. And I started to think, like, yeah. And this isn't like, some true crimes that I watch today are like, this happened in the 60s and now someone's writing about it, or this happened in the 20s and now someone's writing about it. And I don't think that changes the devastation surrounding the crime, because someone in all cases has lost their life, and it's usually completely unjustified, uncalled for, terribly sad. But for the most part, and I'm thinking, I really like watching BuzzFeed Unsolved videos, and a lot of those happened like a long time ago, or decades and decades ago, and while there might still be some family members left, a lot of them have died off, or they're just so old where it's not like a fresh wound. But thinking about this book was published in 1966, a year after the murderers were executed. And the murders happened in 1959. Truman Capote apparently spent quite a bit of time in Holcomb, Kansas. I think he first went in 1962, maybe 1961, but he was there for quite a bit of time. And that made me think, like, that must have been awful for not only the people in the town who knew the family, but also for the daughters to have this reporter constantly hounding you and hounding everyone you know just a few years after your entire family was murdered, or an entire family in your neighborhood was murdered. I can understand the families and some of the other families that knew the Clutters' frustration, apprehension, outright anger at the book. And it really changes the way I read the book. It made me question, like, every single sentence I read. Is this true though? Or is this just a fabrication or elaboration by Capote? Especially like the last scene. I found out the last scene, it was written, again, super well, super detailed. Felt like I was there. It takes place in a cemetery with like the detective going around looking at all the different graves. But then I find out that the detective said that never happened. That there was never that scene in the graveyard. And I'm like, oh. So it kind of like ruined that scene for me. So, like I said, I'm really torn about this book. I gave it a 4 on Goodreads, but it's a complicated 4. It's a nuanced 4. It's like a 4 with like a footnote on it. And it's like, it gets a 4 for its writing, it gets a 4 for the important cultural influence, but it doesn't get a 4 for being accurate, it doesn't get a 4 for being unbiased, and it doesn't get a 4 for the investigative methods it used to compile this book about a real human tragedy. And that's my thoughts about that. Let me know if you've ever read In Cold Blood, if you came away with the same thoughts and opinions as I did, or if you have different thoughts and opinions. Leave a comment down below. I would love to get a discussion going about the book. Like the video, share the video, tell your other book-loving friends I'm doing this. Thank you so much for having this discussion with me. I hope it distracted you just a tiny little bit from the crazy world outside. I hope you have a good day. Bye!